Crusades. You may hear the word and instantly think of the Holy Land, Knights Templar, and legendary characters like Richard the Lionhearted and Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to his enemies as Saladin. And while the several Crusades of the Holy Land are the most famous, they are far from the only ones. In the medieval era, everywhere Christianity was pushing its frontiers, even up here in the north. Medieval Swedish kings sent expeditions east to Finland to spread the Christian faith and to expand their own territories and influence. In this episode, we will examine those expeditions, their causes, effects, and whether or not they can truly be called crusades at all. This is the story of the Swedish Crusades in Finland. First off, who are the Finns? The Finnish people, Suomalaiset as they call themselves, are a rather unique group in Northern Europe. Linguistically, they have little to no connections to their surroundings other than the Sami in the north and the Estonians in the south. Their language belongs to the Uralic language group, which is unrelated both to the Slavic languages of Russia and the Germanic languages of Scandinavia. By the time of the Middle Ages, the Finns inhabited the forests and lakes of what is now Finland, living in small kin-based communities rather than centralized kingdoms. They were far out of reach from the growing centers of Scandinavian power, at least for the time being. Where the name Finns come from, we're not really sure. There are sources from the 1st and 2nd century AD that mention Fenni or Finnoi. The Norse sagas also mention Finnar. The word's meaning is disputed, and suggestions have been finder or wanderer. These communities were not uniform. Different tribes occupied different regions, such as the Tavastians in the south-central inland, the Karelians in the east near Lake Ladoga, and the Finns proper along the southwestern coast. Each had its own local customs and rivalries, which would later play a role in how they encountered foreign powers. Most people lived as farmers, hunters, and fishers, relying on the dense forests and thousands of lakes for survival. Trade existed, but it was limited and often local, with occasional contact through river routes to Novgorod in the east or the Baltic coast. There were no large cities, just scattered villages and fortified hill forts that served as refuges during conflict. Before Christianity reached Finland, their beliefs were rooted in Finnish paganism, a nature-based religion with gods tied to forests, water, and the sky, and a strong tradition of shamanism and spirit worship. Their oral traditions and epic poetry, later preserved in works like the Kalevala, were central to their identity. And it is into this world, isolated, diverse, and deeply rooted in its own traditions, that the Swedish Crusaders arrived. The First Swedish Crusade is traditionally seen as Sweden's first attempt to expand eastwards and take control of the Finnish areas and the Baltic Sea. The traditional dating for it is sometime in the 1150s, the most cited years being between 1155 and 1157. The expedition was led by Erik Edvardsson, later known as Saint Eric, and Bishop Henry, or Henrik, of Uppsala, later known as Saint Henry. Problem: the only source we have is the legend of Saint Eric, written 150 years after the fact, and it has a lot of plot holes in it. We're not sure the crusade happened, or if Bishop Henry ever even existed. Eric is supposed to have been crowned king before the crusade set off. Given that the previous king, Sverker the Elder, died around 1155 and Eric himself was killed in 1160, he must have been mighty quick in order to do that. He would also have to have left his unstable kingdom open to attack from the several other pretenders to the throne at the time. So it's more likely that, if we assume that the crusade actually took place, Eric did it before he was crowned king. His descendants would, however, probably have thought that it was way cooler to have a crusader king at the head of the dynasty rather than someone who was just a crusader and then became king. Bishop Henry is supposed to have come from Britain to Uppsala in the retinue of papal legate Nicholas Breakspere, the later Pope Adrian IV, and appointed as the Bishop of Uppsala by him. There are no sources mentioning his arrival or appointment. When in Finland, he was supposedly murdered by Lalli on the ice of Köyliönjärvi in 1156. Lalli is a well-known figure in Finnish folklore, so it's basically like saying someone was killed by King Arthur or Robin Hood. This martyr's death would be the basis of his sainthood, and he would become the patron saint of the Catholic Church in Finland. Real or not. The Novgorod Chronicles do mention something interesting in 1142. Novgorodian merchants sailing across the Baltic Sea encountered a Swedish fleet led by a knyaz, that is, a king or earl, and a bishop. The fleet wasn't on its way to Novgorodian territory, so it could have been headed for Finland. Could this have been Eric and Henry? Possibly, but the timeline doesn't fit and historians remain divided. Whenever the crusade happened, if it did, it wouldn't have been something that Eric and Henry just came up with on their own one morning. It would instead likely have been an offshoot of the Second Crusade, which was going on at the same time. The expedition would also have been controlled from the archbishopric in Lund, under Danish rule at the time, rather than from Uppsala, which didn't become its own archbishopric until 1164. Lastly, the areas of southwestern Finland where the crusade happened and the Finns proper that lived there had already been Christian for a couple of centuries. We find Christian-style grave sites from the 11th and 12th centuries here. It's kind of odd to crusade against people who are already on your side. You could argue that maybe the Finns were Russian Orthodox rather than Catholic, but we don't have any evidence of such Christianization efforts from the East either. Even with all the inconsistencies in the legend, what is true is that Sweden did establish outposts in the southwesternmost part of Finland in the 1100s. We're just not sure exactly when and to what extent. So that's round one, the crusade that wasn't really a crusade and is more legend than history. If round one was shrouded in legend, round two brings us closer to history. Unlike the first, the Second Swedish Crusade is firmly rooted in more historical sources. Our main source is the Eric Chronicle, written in the late 1300s. Not about Saint Eric, but about later kings named Eric. Erik Eriksson and Erik Magnusson. Sweden has had a lot of Erics on the throne throughout history, over a dozen of them, in fact. The main character of our story isn't named Eric, though. He is named Birger Magnusson, known to history and most Swedes as Birger Jarl. He deserves his own episode at some point, but here we'll have to focus on the Crusade. By the mid-1200s, the Swedish presence in southwestern Finland, known as Finland proper, was well established and the crown started looking further east. The Treaty of Lödöse in 1249 between Sweden and Norway calmed relations between the two kingdoms and offered an opportunity for Sweden to instead turn to the east, and the sword of Christendom would fall on the Tavastians. The Tavastians were a tribe of Pagan Finns living in the inland of southern Finland, being called Hämeläiset in Finnish and Tavaster in Swedish. The province of Tavastia was and is known as Häme in Finnish. To this day, the Tavastians remain a subgroup of the Finnish people, distinguished by their use of Tavastian dialects. The call for a crusade didn't come entirely unprompted. In 1236 to 1237, the Tavastians rebelled against the encroaching Swedish kingdom and the Catholic Church. They did so with the aid of the Novgorod Republic, who in turn was seeking to diminish Swedish influence in the region and instead bolster its own position. According to the papal letter issued by Pope Gregory IX in 1237, the Tavastians destroyed the Catholic Church in Tavastia and returned to their pagan beliefs. They also, supposedly, forcibly extract the innards of adults, sacrifice them to evil spirits, and blind some priests, cruelly mutilate their hands and other limbs, and burn the remaining survivors wrapped in straw as fuel for the fire. This letter has later been seen as papal propaganda to justify the crusade. Here there's also a slight dating inconsistency. The papal letter is written in 1237 and it calls for Sweden to attack, but the Eric Chronicle puts the actual crusade between 1249 and 1250, over a decade later. This has led some researchers to believe that the crusade actually took place between 1238 and 1239. Which one is true we'll probably never know for sure, and historians remain divided on the issue. The pagan Tavastians, the Hedna Tavesta to the Swedes, didn't stand much of a chance against Birger Jarl's army, and the crusade resulted in Tavastia becoming part of the Swedish kingdom, pushing its border further east. To solidify control, the Swedes built a castle, Tavestaborg. Which castle this actually is has been disputed. Traditionally, it has been interpreted as Häme Castle, Tavastehus, although the nearby Hakoinen Castle has come up as a more likely candidate since in 16th century sources it's already known as the Old Häme Castle. And that's the end of round 2. This was a real military campaign that can be substantiated in the historical sources. It can also be seen as an actual crusade due to the letter from Pope Gregory, propagandistic as it was. It's also probably in no small part an opportunity for Sweden and the Catholic Church to strengthen their hold on the region to push back the Orthodox Novgorodians. As an important aside, these are some of the earliest known stowings of the antagonistic relationship between Sweden and what would become Russia. We're not done yet though. Round 2 is finished, but in round 3, Sweden will push even further east. Plans for the third Swedish Crusade were laid soon after the second. King Valdemar Birgersson, the son of Birger Jarl, procured a papal letter from Pope Alexander IV in 1257. This letter granted spiritual justification for wars against the remaining Finnish pagans, but it would take 30 years before the military operations could actually begin. The target this time was Karelia, the southeastern part of modern-day Finland, stretching into western Russia. Here lived, unsurprisingly, the Karelians, Karjalaiset, the third of the ancient pagan Finnish tribes, beside the Finns proper and the Tavastians. Like the others, they are a recognized group today and speak their own Karelian dialects of Finnish. Karelia was under the control of Novgorod in the mid-1200s, and the Karelian attacks on Swedish territories in 1257 prompted King Valdemar's request to Pope Alexander to declare a crusade. In 1292, Novgorod had attacked Tavastia, and later they themselves came under the attack from the Tatars to the south. This was as good an opportunity as any for King Birger Magnusson of Sweden to make his move. As a side note, this isn't Birger Jarl, but a later king of the same name. In the spring of 1293, a large Swedish fleet commanded by the Marshal Torkel Knutsson sailed to Finland. The target was the harbor and marketplace at Suomenvedenpohja, located at the now dried up western outlet of the river Vuxen. The Swedes burned down the Karelian fort and built a new castle in its place, Viborg Castle. This castle would give its name to the city that would grow around it, the modern Russian city of Viborg. The fleet returned to Sweden in the autumn, leaving a garrison in its now easternmost holding. Novgorodian troops besieged Viborg in March of 1294. They led an assault across the frozen river but were stopped by the weather. A mild warm wind came up from the south and partly melted the ice. The Novgorodians had no boats, so the assault was abandoned. It would appear to the garrison of the castle that God intended Viborg to remain Swedish, and it would, at least for a couple hundred more years. A new fleet from Sweden arrived later in the spring, and they quickly attacked and conquered Korela fortress, Kexholm, to the Swedes. This conquest wouldn't last long, as a Novgorodian force took the fortress back in 1295. The loss of Kexholm would put an end to the Third Swedish Crusade. As with the Second, the Third Crusade can be seen as an actual crusade, but similarly also yet another move in Sweden's ambition to control Finland and the Baltic region, rather than simply being a mission to convert the Karelian pagans to Christianity. The overall effect of the Crusades as a whole was a strong Swedish presence in Finland that remained as such for several centuries. Finland wouldn't just be an occupied remote region, but a proper integrated province of the Swedish realm, the Eastern lands, Östlanden. So that is the tale of the Swedish Crusades. The tensions between Sweden and Novgorod would however remain and again lead to war in the year 1300, the Neva campaign. But that's a story for another time. Thank you for watching.